Now. For today's meeting, we're very pleased to welcome Jessica Locklear, who will discuss the ways Lumbee people were forced to reckon with and make sense of their own identities within the frameworks of race held by those they interacted with when they left their homelands in southeastern North Carolina in search of economic opportunities for survival further south. Jessica is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Emory University and an enrolled member of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. Jessica's research focuses on migrations carried out by members and ancestors of the present-day Lumbee tribe of North Carolina throughout the 20th century. Jessica's dissertation project demonstrates that Lumbee people have intergenerational histories of utilizing mobility to adapt to ever-changing historical circumstances while maintaining distinct Indigenous identities. By examining Lumbee experiences living away from tribal homelands, Jessica hopes to make the processes of racial formation in the 20th century more visible to historians of the United States, both in a general sense and as it specifically relates to and impacts the lives of American Indian people. She is currently the NACI Predoctoral Fellow here at the APS. With that, I'll turn the floor over to Jessica. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. First of all, I would like to thank the Center for Native American Indigenous Research at APS for hosting this awesome Indigenous Learning Forum, and for all of you for taking time out of your day to listen. As Ruth mentioned, I'm currently writing my dissertation on voluntary acts of migrations or the practice of mobility carried out by members and ancestors of the present-day Lumbee tribe of North Carolina from about the 1880s to the present. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, members of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina call Robeson, Hoke, and Scotland and Cumberland counties home. Lumbee families trace their origins to the many and diverse Siouan, Algonquin, and Iroquoian-speaking communities of the Carolina Piedmont that coalesced in response to colonial pressures in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. As these peoples came together in the dense swamps of southeastern North Carolina, they lived as free people and for a time enjoyed many of the same rights as their white neighbors. For Lumbees, the pursuit and maintenance of private land ownership in southeastern North Carolina has been a key strategy for self-determination and survival. Because Lumbees had acquired titles to their lands and owned their lands privately, they were able to evade the large-scale dispossession of Indigenous peoples in the Southeast carried out by the federal government in the 1830s. While Lumbees avoided physical removal from their homelands, they were subjected to a different kind of removal, and this was the legal erasure of their identity. So in 1835, the state of North Carolina revised its constitution, which codified a racial hierarchy built on the principle that individuals were either white or non-white. This creation of a racial binary left no room for nuance in what it meant to be non-white, so there was no distinction made between people who were of African, Indigenous, or mixed ancestry. You were either white or not. That being said, all non-white people were disenfranchised and lost the freedoms that they once had, including the right to vote and bear arms. Other legal restrictions prevented Indians and other free people of color from marrying whites, collecting debt from whites, and testifying against whites in the court of law. Lumbee historian Melinda Maynard Lowry notes that the loss of political and economic freedoms led to the erosion of Lumbee land holdings. Local whites often accused Indians of stealing farm animals, and since Indians could not testify against white people in court, the resolution was often payment to the white farmer in land. So after the Civil War, the loss of the community's land base continued to be a pressing concern for Indians, as many families struggled to pay the taxes that they owed on their lands. Those who could not pay were forced to sell or auction off portions of their land, often to neighboring white farmers. Lumbee families who lost their lands turned to sharecropping and tenant farming, a system of agricultural production that benefited landowners and kept laborers in a continuous state of poverty. In order to protect against further erosion of their land base, Lumbees sought economic opportunities outside of farming that would generate just enough income for them to be able to retain ownership of their lands. So one economic opportunity that Lumbee men in particular pursued was working in the naval stores industry and the production of turpentine. Work in the industry involved the extraction and processing of resin from longleaf pine trees to produce materials such as tar, pitch, rosin, and turpentine. The term naval stores actually comes from the fact that these materials were most often used to seal wooden ships. North Carolina was the largest producer of naval stores from the colonial period up to the 1870s because the state was home to an abundant amount of longleaf pine forests. In order to extract the resin from a pine tree to make turpentine, laborers would have to make small cavities into the bottom of a tree trunk. And this process was called boxing. You can see that here in this picture. Then, after a box was cut into the tree, somebody would come along and chip the bark, which would allow the resin to flow out of the tree and collect into the box. Now, after a certain amount of time, the sap would dry and a fresh cut would have to be made above the previous one to get the tree resin flowing again. When resin was ready to be collected, people known as dippers would come and remove the resin from the box and scrape any excess that had built up along the tree trunk. After the resin was collected, it would be taken to a distillery where it would be heated and refined and barreled. This work was labor intensive and the industry was notorious for its harsh working conditions. Prior to the Civil War, large-scale naval store operators dominated the industry and relied heavily on enslaved labor to carry out this work. Now, the problem with cutting large sections of making large cuts into a pine tree is that the tree will eventually die. And the typical lifespan of a longleaf pine subjected to this process was about 3 to 6 years, and the typical turpentine operation couldn't be supported by the same forest for more than 10 years. By the end of the Civil War, North Carolina's pine forests had been nearly completely depleted and obliterated through this highly destructive and unsustainable practice. So in order to address this issue, many North Carolina turpentine producers searched for new untapped pine forests and began buying up pine lands further south, starting in South Carolina and then making their way to Georgia, Florida, and eventually into Alabama and Mississippi. With the abolishment of slavery, turpentiners struggled to find cheap and reliable labor force to carry out this undesirable work. Prior to the Civil War, a number of Lumbees had worked as wage laborers for nearby turpentine producers as an alternative or supplement to farming. Some even ran their own small-scale turpentine operations. After the Civil War, some Lumbees followed these producers southward. While the work was harsh and the pay was poor, the struggle to find laborers meant that there were plenty of jobs for Indians to have. Many Lumbees were in such desperate economic condition that they found it worthwhile and potentially profitable to pursue this. Between 1870 and the 1920s, dozens upon dozens of Lumbee families migrated southward to work in turpentine. While I could go into more detail about why Lumbees decided to follow the naval stores industry southward, my dissertation research is more concerned with how Lumbees encountered the world outside of their tribal homelands and what impact these experiences had on their identity as Indians. Within the Lumbee community, it is nearly impossible to find somebody whose ancestors did not migrate southward to work in turpentine at some point. However, finding evidence that explicitly recounts these experiences is very hard to find in archival collections. So how does one even begin to understand the lived experiences of these people? While it can be difficult to track down and identify written evidence of Lumbee migration southward, I rely on methods of ethnohistory and Indigenous studies to find and read the sources that do exist with a critical eye and to be able to understand what sources are about Lumbee people, even when they explicitly don't say that. For example, the term Lumbee was not used to refer to our people until the 1950s. During this time, during the turpentine migrations, Lumbees were recognized as Croatan Indians by the state of North Carolina, and neighboring whites, often called Croatans, Scuffletonians, meaning that they came from Scuffletown, the Lumbee homeland, which many outsiders viewed as a lawless place where Indians lived freely. In addition to reading for changes in vocabulary and terminology, I have relied heavily on my own kinship ties and knowledge of my own ancestors' experiences, along with insight from the community as a starting point for finding these people in written records. Fortunately for me, I was able to start my research journey by attending the annual pilgrimage to Bullitt County, Georgia. And you can see on this map kind of where Bullitt County is located in Georgia. It's kind of southeast corner, not too far off from Savannah. So every year, a group of Lumbees get together and they travel to Bullitt County, Georgia. And they've been doing this since the 1980s or so. And people do this so that they can visit the location of the former Ada Bell settlement, a place that Lumbees migrated to in the late 19th century. The pilgrimage, as many people describe it, is a way for people to honor, remember, and celebrate the lives of their ancestors who lived there in order to sustain their families. The focal point of the pilgrimage is cleaning the cemetery where over 60 Lumbee individuals were buried in the early 20th century, many in unmarked graves. While individuals worked at removing and raking the weeds and overgrown brush into piles, people cheerfully connected with one another, and we tried to figure out who everyone's people were and how we might be related. As we worked, people, old and young, shared stories that their relatives passed down to them about their experiences living in Georgia. It's hard to be in this kind of place and not wonder what life was like for our ancestors who moved and lived here. Upon reminiscing on the past, some individuals asserted that the Indians who moved here were able to prosper. They made decent money working in turpentine, and they were able to start an Indian church and an Indian school. They made enough money to retain and return to their homelands back in North Carolina by the 1920s. Others questioned how Indians could prosper here as racism abounded in southeastern Georgia, and turpentine producers promoted employment conditions that both exploited and kept laborers in poverty. It seemed as if the individuals participating in the pilgrimage were struggling to reconcile some of the fond memories that their ancestors passed down about this place versus the harsh realities that would have accompanied this type of wage laboring. I too struggled to make sense of these competing narratives. As I continued my search, I noted that Bullitt County, Georgia was just one of the many places that Lumbees migrated to, but yet this seems to be the only place that is explicitly remembered and celebrated in this way. In fact, my grandmother told me that she didn't even realize until much later in her life that her own father was born in a Mississippi turpentine camp. In these other places, the connections between present-day communities and Lumbees who once lived there are less clear. So why do we as Lumbees remember and celebrate the Ada Bell story, while stories of living in other parts of southeastern Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi seem to be forgotten? What was life really like for these Lumbees who followed the pines southward? So based on surveys of census records, it appears that Lumbees began migrating to Georgia right around or slightly before 1880. And because turpentine was such an unstable industry and producers were constantly moving, Lumbee laborers followed. Some of the first Lumbees to migrate southward appear to be mostly young men in their late teens and early 20s who worked in turpentine for a few months and then returned home and then started this process over again. One Georgia newspaper article openly criticized the fact that Scuffletonians, which is a slang term for Lumbees, would work for a time and leave, and this frustrated them. As time progressed, it appears that Lumbees started viewing turpentine not just as a seasonal supplemental job, but as a stable source of income that they could use to support their families. And by 1900, many Lumbee families, men, women, and children all included, could be seen living in these turpentine camps. While the 1890 census was lost in a fire, newspaper records prove useful for gaining insight into Lumbee experiences in Georgia and beyond. Most of these articles provide commentary on crimes committed by Lumbees, But the picture that we get from examining these newspaper articles together is useful in showing that Lumbees were maintaining and asserting an Indian identity away from home. Additionally, these articles viewed together show the ways that outsiders were processing the assertion of this Indian identity in a region where Indigenous peoples were thought to have been either removed or extinct. While there are dozens of articles that I could show you, let's take a look at some of these clippings here. This is from a Georgia newspaper, and the article is titled, "Who Are the Croatans?" And as I mentioned, Lumbees were once known as Croatans in North Carolina. And it says, "Who are the Croatans? On the turpentine farms of Captain G. McKinnon and Mr. S.A. Alford near Statesboro, the most of the laborers are Croatans. They are about the color of Indians, and the women and children who are not exposed much to the sun are real bright in color. The men and women have straight hair, and they are intelligent people. They are said to be honest and industrious. They stick to each other and don't mix much with the Negroes. Captain McKinnon tells us that they are a distinct race in North Carolina, where their homes are, and that they are a supposed mixture of Indian and Portuguese." So it appears that upon their arrival in Georgia in the 1880s, that Lumbees were actively refusing to be classified within the boundaries of the racial binary that dominated Southern life. Rather than being accepted or classified as either white or non-white, Lumbees resisted the erasure of their identity and asserted that they were a distinct people who had come from a place in a distinct homeland. In newspaper clippings from the 1880s until the 1890s, Georgians largely acknowledged that Lumbees were a distinct people who were industrious and willing to work. However, in the 1890s, commentaries on Lumbee identity began to change as Georgians realized that the existence of Indigenous peoples threatened their social order predicated upon a racial hierarchy that upheld white supremacy. Historian Melinda Maynor Lowry writes that the ambiguous racial category that Indians filled indicates how large a problem their presence was in Jim Crow Georgia, where racial categories determined everything from who cut your hair to where your children went to school. This 1893 article from the Atlanta Journal demonstrates this stark shift in attitude. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you can tell from the last paragraph that white Georgians were not too impressed or endearing to Lumbee people. Evidence of this can also be seen here in the collections of the American Philosophical Society. A man named Roland Harper, who was a botanist and later became a eugenicist, encountered Lumbees in Bullitt County, Georgia, where he spent a good amount of time. And this is a letter from the APS collections in which Harper is kind of startled by these Croatan Indians and is suggesting to Charles Davenport, who was the head of the American Eugenics Society, that this group of Indians should be studied. And as you read more of his materials, you realize that he really believed that the presence of Lumbee people in Georgia was a threat. And he wrote quite extensively about how he was concerned that their birth rate was increasing. So just like African-American laborers who worked turpentine in the pine forests, Lumbees too were subjected to the racial violence and terror that was all too common in the South. Dozens more newspaper clippings document Lumbees murdering others, being murdered, committing crimes, being framed for crimes, and even being lynched. Oral histories left behind by Lumbees who grew up as children in the Deep South confirm that following the pines was often a dangerous journey, and that even though families were making more money than they were back in North Carolina, many still lived in abject poverty. While newspaper clippings make Lumbee migration stories seem centered around Lumbee men, we can't forget that many Lumbees who moved to Georgia and beyond moved as family units, while others started families and raised their children there. So in order to get a more complete picture of Lumbee life migrating in the Deep South, we can turn to oral histories and community knowledge. So my third great-grandfather, Mr. Amazar Chavis, who's pictured here on the right, migrated to southeastern Georgia around 1889 and not much documentation exists that would give one insight into his life other than the data that can be extracted from this census record here from 1900. The record shows that he lived in Irwin County, Georgia, with his wife and 10 children, and that he worked as a turpentine teamster, which was somebody who would transport the finished barrels of turpentine to market. In the 1970s, Adolf Dial, an early Lumbee scholar, conducted an oral history interview with Amzar's son, Danny Chavis, my great-great-grandfather. Danny noted that his father, Amazar, went to work in Georgia alone at first, leaving his wife and children back in North Carolina. After some time, Amazar returned for his family, bringing them southward with him. Danny recalled that he was just 2 weeks old when the family moved to Georgia and that they didn't return to North Carolina permanently until he was 12. Danny also recalled that the Indians who moved southward typically stuck together in small groups, usually linked by kinship. He noted that the people worked hard during the week, but on Saturday nights, just like anybody else, they would sit around, drink, and enjoy one another's company. Adolf Dial writes that amongst the people who worked in turpentine, there was a strong sense of community born of love for one's neighbor and of necessity, a sense that gave Lumbee life a richness that could never be measured materially. Lumbee forebears were mainly concerned with making a living and knowing some pleasure, not with becoming wealthy. Dial's quote serves as a reminder that even though life working in turpentine was harsh, Lumbees used this exploitative industry for their own purposes and benefits. And though many families lived and navigated their way through the Deep South across multiple decades, Lumbees did this not with the intention of becoming wealthy, but by making just enough that would ensure that their children could eventually return home. Dial also concluded from his interviews that with the passage of time, the human mind has a way of weeding out the bad memories and preserving the good. And I think that this is a good way to start answering why certain migration destinations like Adabel are remembered and why others are forgotten. In my research so far, it appears that in Adabel, Lumbee settled in high numbers and were able to achieve a greater degree of recognition as Indians than they did in other parts of Georgia and beyond. Because there was such a large number of Lumbee families in Adabel, they were more successful in refusing to be categorized as either Black or white. In a way, Adabel is a bit of an anomaly as far as these southern migrations are concerned, because Lumbees were successful in creating Indian-only institutions, which included a church and a school, which solidified their place in this particular part of the South. In other parts of the Deep South, where Lumbee settled in smaller, less visible groups, Lumbee still asserted their Indian identity, but it seems that outsiders were less willing to accept them as indigenous. For example, my third great-grandmother, Direna Goins, who's pictured here, migrated with her husband Silas to northern Florida so he could work in turpentine. Family stories say that Silas was murdered or killed in Florida, and that after his death, Direna worked as a domestic servant for a family in Jackson County, Florida. Florida census takers erased her Indian identity by listing her and her son as mulatto, which meant mixed race. However, upon returning to North Carolina, she is once again labeled as Indian. Direna's grandson, my great-grandfather, Henry Chavis, was born in the turpentine camp in Hancock County, Mississippi. His birth certificate, pictured here, shows that whoever filled out his birth certificate labeled him not even as mulatto, but Black. Sometime much later in his life, after the family had returned to North Carolina, he went through the legal process of having his birth certificate changed by court order to reflect and assert his identity as an Indian. I can't help but assume that life for Lumbees became increasingly difficult as they moved further into the Deep South because of an ongoing commitment to the preservation of a racial hierarchy built on anti-Blackness. While I don't have time to share all the things that I found so far with you here today, my research is showing the ways that Indian refusal of a white and Black racial hierarchy often and sometimes came at the cost of fracturing families and communities. For example, one of Dirina's sons appeared to have married a Black woman while he was working turpentine in Louisiana. While all other members of the family returned to North Carolina, it appears that he and his wife were not as welcome back, and this appears to be a widespread pattern amongst Lumbees who did intermarry with African Americans while working in the Deep South. As unfortunate as this is, the fact that interracial marriage fractured Lumbee families and kinship shows just how powerful and widespread ideologies of race and racial inferiority were moving into the 20th century. When the turpentine industry collapsed in the 1930s, most Lumbees have returned to their lands in North Carolina, where they continue to fight against the erasure of their Indian identity. I think the fact that Lumbees were able to preserve a sense of identity and community over decades of absence from tribal homelands, which sometimes span generations, shows that mobility was indeed a defining experience for Lumbees going into the 20th century and beyond. And I am super happy to hear your questions and to have a conversation about anything that y'all might be willing to talk about. So I'm going to turn it over to Ruth.
Thank you, Jessica. That was wonderful. And I'm sure we have questions among some of the 70 people who are listening in. If you have a question and you'd like to put your hand up or type something into the chat, please do. Jessica, do you want to stop sharing screen so we can see everybody? All right. And I'm going to change to gallery view. Any questions? And Thomas, if you see questions that I'm missing, please let me know. I see something from Sophia Locklear in the chat. Jessica, can you tell us all about the amazing photo you started and end with?
Yeah, so this is a photo that I took of the Lumbee River in North Carolina, and I used it because I think it's a great representation of where we come from and this place that keeps Lumbee people together throughout time. So I really like it, and I didn't share this in my presentation, but I think a super powerful kind of image of this is actually in the pilgrimage that we took to Georgia. One of the things that people have been doing since the 80s is that they will actually take some of the soil from around that river and some of the water from the river itself, and we will all take a bit of it and sprinkle it into the graveyard as a way of kind of returning the land to the people, and making sure that that connection kind of lives through time past those people's lives. So it's, I think, a nice symbol for me and hopefully for other people as well.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a bunch of things in the chat. Morgana, do you have your question phrasing yet, or do you want us to skip to the next person? Okay, I will move to the next person. So we have David Shane Lowry asks, do you see Lumbees entering the emerging post-Civil War Black political power structure in Georgia?
I think that's a great question. I have to let me think about that one. I'm gonna come back to it. It's a pretty loaded question.
Okay, we have Ashley Minard-Jones. Jessica, in your research, did you uncover any family history that your family didn't already know?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, again, something that I didn't share today, but I'm going to now, is that you find out things that have been kind of erased from our kind of memory of these migrations. I mean, one of the most surprising, if not just mind-blowing things that I've discovered is that Dirina, who was the woman that I shared her photo, came from a small kind of community of Indians in North Carolina that was in, I guess, on the border of like Cumberland and Moore County, if you're familiar with the area. So still like part of this larger Lumbee group, but a kind of smaller like subgroup within, the larger piece. And I realized that she came from a family of turpentiners who were quite wealthy before the Civil War, and that basically, the forest became depleted, and the Goins family, what's their names? They moved their turpentine operation to Florida. And so I kind of went down this rabbit hole of tracing their business that they moved. And I realized that uh, basically they reestablished their business in a town called Rosewood, Florida. And those of you who are familiar might have heard that name. Rosewood was the site of a very infamous race massacre in 1923. And so I found out that that was actually her family. And you can't help but wonder if, her husband, they just say that he was killed. Is there a tie to this, the Rosewood massacre? It's hard for me to think that there's no relation there, just because of how tight those kinship ties. And it's still not 100% clear, but just following that particular path has opened up a lot of very interesting questions and conversations with even some of the other descendants who never got to come back to North Carolina.
Thank you. So we have several more questions in the chat, and we have at least one hand raised. So I'll go to the questions that were already in the chat when the hand went up, and we'll go to David Scott. Kadira Locke asks, do you have any recommendations for ways younger Lumbees are able to look into this migrational history within our own families?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say absolutely look at the Adolph Dial oral history interviews. The transcripts are online in the University of Florida's collection, oral history collection, and the audio is actually available at UNC Pembroke. It's currently being worked on, so you can't look at it right now, but hopefully in a couple weeks they'll be back up. And I suggest that if you know, like just scroll through the names, see if any of those names seem familiar. You might be surprised that, somebody on there might be your great great grandfather, and listen to the interview. And 9 times out of 10, in those interviews, these migration experiences come up because they're just so significant to these people's lives.
The next question is somewhat related from Carrie Lowry Shootbills. I'd love to know about some of the collections you used in your research, especially the dial interviews.
Yeah, so like I said, it's pretty hard to like track down these people since they're moving, and when people move, it's hard to find them. And so a lot of my research often feels like trying to find needles in lots of haystacks. And I definitely have to come down and like rely on my own connections to the community, especially things like genealogy, in order to locate other sources that are in archives. And so it's kind of an interesting journey because you find things in places that you never thought you would find things. And the things that I use are scattered all over the place, but I've been able to pull out migration stories even from some of the federal records that are at the National Archives in DC, and the BIA records, because again, like even though it's a different, you think oh, that's not about migration. Those stories are in there. I mean, you wouldn't think that they would be, but they are. And I think it's pretty cool.
Thanks. And it looks like Ashley put a link in the chat to some materials. So now I'll go to, I think it was David Scott. Was that who had their hand raised? You still have a question?
Hey there, no worries. That was my question about the migration, finding the history. Where do you get started out? So thanks.
Yeah,
Okay,
absolutely.
great. Okay, so now Morgana has the question articulated now, so I will read that and then go back up to the next one after that. They say, as I was listening, I was stunned by some of the similarities in family history that I recognized from my own. What advice would you give to someone new to this kind of research, who was raised white, presenting, passing, who wants to learn more about their history, but also be very careful about the kind of space they're taking up? My grandfather was born in 1936, Wrightsville, Georgia. His mom was from the Florida Keys and not a free woman, but his aunt raised him, took him from the Keys to rural Georgia. He came back to Miami later, but he sees himself as only white still. Not sure if I'm making sense. but as this type of research is easier now with the internet and ancestry tests, what advice would you give to newer researchers who want to be really mindful of the really loaded politics of such things?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that's something that's becoming very clear to me through this research, and that's important, is that I think these stories reveal that throughout time and throughout migration in particular, people are making choices about who they want to be and how they want to identify. And in almost every case, in every family case, there's always somebody that decides to leave. And that's okay. And those people are part of that story, right? But there's plenty of people who, we could say passed for white and married into white families and never came back. And those connections kind of got lost. And it is what it is. But just again, start talking, start digging, start finding, and see what you can come up with, and you might be surprised.
Okay, so I hope I'm not missing anybody. Then I believe the next question is, Jessica, what were some of the cultural practices that were celebrated and retained when our ancestors migrated to different regions?
That's a great question. So I will go back to Direna just because her story is so fascinating to me too. So one thing that I am so fortunate to have is I actually have a piece of pottery that she made, and that she carried with her kind of on this migration journey. And my grandmother had it and gave it to me. And I also like can't help but think that this knowledge of creating this very distinct style of pottery, you'd have to see it to kind of know what I'm talking about, is something that was passed down to her from her mother and grandmother and et cetera, et cetera. And so I think some of those things that get carried down are sometimes like passed down or overlooked, just because they are not explicitly talked about in these collections. But again, like when you listen to the oral histories, it becomes abundantly clear that these people, when they moved, are literally just trying to recreate life from back home in another place. They're just trying to exist as the way that they would exist back in North Carolina. And sometimes it's the little things that are passed down. It could be food that people cook. It could be the way people dress or make their clothes or et cetera, et cetera. So yeah.
I think the next question is a little similar. Is this part of your history preserved by songs, music, dances, or specific story themes collected to the moving in and out of territory?
It's a great question. I really haven't thought about this a whole lot. I think, yeah, let me think about this one and come back to it. Yeah, give me a minute.
Sure, we've got lots more questions. Yeah, there's a comment that someone had a grandmother and great grandmother and father in Florida, but didn't know what town they were in. I think now we're at Joanne's question. Where did the name Lumbee come from? What connotation does the word Lumbee have for non-Indians and for Lumbee themselves? Today, are Lumbees interested in returning to the name Croatan?
Yeah, so ooh, this is a jam-packed question. So I think in a nutshell, the term Lumbee thought to thought to mean people of the dark water, and that comes from the river, which is the photo that I showed at the beginning and the end. The water is very deep and it has a very distinct tea-colored, um, you know, vibe going on, and so apparently that's what the name is supposed to mean. The name Croatan came from a guy named Hamilton McMillan, who was basically advocating for the state to recognize Indians and give them funds to have their own school. And this kind of comes from this theory that he had that Lumbees were descended from members of the Lost Colony in Roanoke, which I think well, regardless of whether you believe that's possible or not, it was kind of a political ploy. And I think that names are often very political. And so I think that the name Lumbee was something that Lumbee people decided that they wanted to be called themselves. And it was voted on in the 50s and accepted. And that's where we're at. And Ashley Minner Jones pointed out that Dr. Lawrence Locklear, who was a great mentor of mine in undergrad, wrote a fantastic article about the origins of and use of the name Lumbee if you're interested in learning more.
All right. Hannah says, hi, Jessica, learning we're cousins, thinking through some things concerning my own research around Indigenous and Black foodways in the South. Were you able to find anything about how Lumbee migration influenced food traditions or agricultural practices?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I don't have a good answer for it because I guess I should be thinking about these things, but I haven't been, just because there's so much. Um, yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't know, but I'm sure there is, there's got to be. Um, yeah.
Um, Before I go on to the next questions, I just wanted to check to see if you wanted to return to any of the questions you deferred earlier, or should we keep going here?
You keep going and I'll
Okay.
come.
Okay. So we have a question from Carolyn. In your research, have you identified if the practice of harvesting for turpentine presented the Lumbee with any sense, burden, or dismay over how this practice caused damage to the lands of their people?
Yeah, I was just reading something. There's a really good book on the history of turpentining as a practice. It's by an author named Robert Outland. It's called Tapping the Pines, and it really is this comprehensive history of this industry. And something that he notes that I've never thought of before is how apparently Indigenous people used to care for the longleaf pine forests, and particularly through this practice of like burning, to like somehow maintain this like ecosystem that was beneficial for the pine. And he talks a little bit about how that was kind of not practiced in this turpentining industry and how it could have been a very useful way, like burning strategically, to help like kind of help the forest recover. And that's about as much as I thought about it. And I just think the sense that I'm getting from listening to oral histories is that people's primary concern was to make money so that they could survive. And if that meant that the pine trees died, then that's what it meant. And that, I mean, I think says something about the condition that people were in and what they were willing to do to try to get out of it.
Um, we have a question, a hand raised in the chat, so I'll call on that person now. Carly Moore, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Jessica. I'm wondering if you can speak to the part about return to Robinson and surrounding counties. What are you seeing about the decision of when to return, how to return? Were people easily reintegrated? Anything you have about that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So for the most part, I'm seeing that most Lumbee people make it to northern Florida and then they kind of hang it up and they say like, you know what, I've had enough of this. And in the oral history interviews that do exist, a lot of people say that this is because of the lack of schools that Lumbee children could go to. And that a lot of parents really felt this pressing burden to educate their children, and that the only way for them to get an education was to go back to Robeson County where they could go to Indian school. And like I said, we talk about Adabel all the time because there was an Indian school in Adabel, but this wasn't the case in other parts of Georgia and beyond, right? And so, for example, in the interview with one of my, great grandfathers, Danny Chavis, he said that his father really felt convicted that his children weren't getting an education, and so bringing them home was kind of a way for parents to make sure that their children would be educated so that they could function in the world outside of agriculture. So I think, yeah, education was a huge motivator to come back, and just also the nature of the industry. As the industry moves farther, competition from like foreign naval source producers intensifies. And so the turpentine industry really comes to a grinding halt in the 30s. And it just becomes less profitable as it moves. So yeah, I'm seeing that most people kind of said they were done by the time it was in northern Florida, but other people did kind of stick it out and make it all the way to Mississippi. And as far as returning home, I think that not everybody moved, right? I don't want to give off this false impression that like all the Lumbees just left North Carolina and there was nobody there. People stayed. Certain, family members stayed and managed things there, while others went away and made money and came back, and life seems to have carried on just as it was before they left, even if it, that absence did span generations.
Okay, we have a question from Robert Walls. Great talk. I'm wondering what the study of language reveals about identities with these workers and communities. Was there a documented occupational jargon for the workers with words that speak to Indigenous traditions? Was this reflected in place names, community names? The connections between language identities and indigeneity were often revealed in the use of occupational jargon of the logging woods in the Pacific Northwest where Indigenous people worked. And this jargon incorporated Chinook jargon, Chinookawa, and words from local Indigenous languages.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think absolutely. And I think listening to some of those oral histories, the way that people talk about certain practices and procedures or just different things, definitely highlights the existence of this Lumbee dialect and certain words that only exist within a Lumbee dialect that are used in these places, and that certain terms come to mean things in this kind of turpentining culture. And then another interesting thing is the use of names. And another thing that I'm finding is that there's this trend in the census records that children who are born in turpentine camps are often named after the city or settlement that the people were living in at the time. And so you'll find a lot of people who were named Adabel, or they were named Rochelle after Rochelle, Georgia, or there's, baby boys that are named Valdosta after Valdosta, Georgia. And so these places even become kind of ingrained into the language. And I think some of those names even end up making their way back into Robeson County's landscape. If I'm not mistaken, there's some small dirt roads back in Robco named Valdosta and such. And so I think that it is something that sticks with people for a long time. That's a really good question. I'm gonna continue to think about that one. Yeah.
I love that geography kind of connection back in Robeson County. Okay, Michelle has a question. Michelle, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question yourself?
Sure. No, mine is and I will apologize because I have to run away in a couple of minutes. We're hosting an event beginning at 4:30. This is a complete left field one. But as soon as you said Croatoa, I was like, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. Wasn't that word that was supposed to have been carved on a tree at the lost colony of Roanoke? It is actually. Is there any connection at all, or no? Is that just plain
Yeah,
text?
exactly. Spot on. And that's, I think, part of the evidence that Hamilton Macmillan used to kind of make this theory. If you want to learn more about that, I think Melinda Lowry writes a lot about it in her book, The Lumbee Indians. And I think she would say that this appeal and connection that Macmillan is proposing, this connection to the lost colony, is actually him trying to get local whites to sympathize with the Indian cause. So like make some kind of emotional connection, personal connection. So white people feel that they're connected with this particular group of Indians and that they will give them the resources to build their school.
Thank you, Jessica.
Yeah. I will also note that during the 20th century, the term Croatan eventually became kind of a slang term and held a very negative racial connotation. It came eventually kind of associated with Jim Crow. And so Croatan kind of got associated with that, and the people really ended up resenting the name because of that, which is part of the reason why it was abandoned.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
We have a question from Elizabeth. Is this part of your history preserved by songs, music, dances? Oh wait, I think we have already had that question before. And then she says, I compare with the Sami people who were forcefully displaced. They've kept these experiences in singing in the Sami style.
Yeah, thanks for that. I really appreciate that question. And again, it's something that I haven't thought a whole lot about, and maybe it's just because the documentation is so sparse and it's hard to know what came from where, and what traditions originated in these other places versus what was just kind of moved with the people. But I definitely think that I'm sure that anywhere that people are being relocated or moved, that they're taking the things that they produce and love with them. So I would just assume that there's got to be something there, but the evidence to be able to find that might be tough.
Ashley has another question. Do you ever feel like your ancestors are guiding you in your work and are telling you where to look for info?
It's kind of funny. Just kind of reflecting along my own kind of journey here. For those of you that I'm sure you know that I started my PhD in Atlanta. And so I feel very fortunate to kind of have lived in all the states that these people lived in. And so I feel like I'm kind of following them in a way in my own life, which is fun. But yeah, I do think there is a bit of guidance there, because by following their lives and what I know about them, they lead me to more questions and more people, and open up paths to knowing about other family stories too, because it's just so hard to kind of find information about people when you're blindly looking around. But when you have a starting point, right, you can easily, get connected to other families to better understand the whole experience.
There is another question in the chat. Did the Lumbee have their own churches or other community centers? Do they have records that are useful?
Yeah, so definitely in North Carolina, Lumbees have and had their own churches, schools, et cetera, et cetera. As far as record keeping goes, those things are, yes, there are. How detailed they are is, varies on thing to thing depending on what you want to find out. But yeah. So like, yes, but also do they have records? Maybe not in the way that other peoples would keep records about things, if that makes sense. So for example, like I mentioned that there was an Indian church that was established in Adabel. Well, there's no records that come from that church, other than other people talking about it, but there's no, like, say, lists of members or anything like that exist anywhere to be able to use. So I hope that answers the question.
And we're almost out of time, but it looks like Carly might have another question.
Yes, thank you. Jessica, I'm trying to think about our territory in North Carolina, and the question is, did people tend to come from particular communities in North Carolina, or was it really just like widespread? For example, like, can you pinpoint and say a lot of people came from Saddle Tree versus somewhere else?
Yeah, excellent question. And I have been kind of paying attention to that a little bit, trying to figure out which. So for those of you that don't know, the Lumbee territory is kind of divided into smaller, again, like sub communities. And I've been trying to see if there's any pattern in are there certain communities where people move more than others? And as far as I can tell now, it seems just a widespread trend. I'm not finding that people of certain communities are moving more than others. It just seems to be those that are willing to go and have the ability to go are going. And again, in the oral history interviews, I think Adolf Dow says, like, man, like, it seemed like everybody was in Georgia at some point. And I think that that's what I'm finding so far. I do think that an argument could be made that where people settle and which place they end up in the Deep South revolves around which community they come from in North Carolina. I think that could be argued for sure.
Thank you, Jessica. So we are at past 4 o'clock. So we should wrap up and let Jessica take a break. Do you have any closing things you want to say, Jessica, before we end?
Yeah, just thank you. And again, this is a work in progress, and I know it's a lot, and I'm still figuring it out. And I appreciate all of your questions, because it's going to encourage me to think more about it as I continue to write and do more research. So thank you.
Great. There are many comments in the chat congratulating you, telling little personal anecdotes that connect, and we will give you that chat transcript too, so you have a record of that. Wonderful talk. Great to hear more about your work. I hope everybody has, ooh, snow's really coming down. I hope everybody has a wonderful, possibly cold afternoon. And thank you again, Jessica, for a great talk.
Yeah, thank you all.